Hi everyone, I hope you're doing brilliantly. So today I'm going to be talking about Exposure by Wilfred Owen, and I think this is a fan favourite simply because there really is so much you can say about it, and I actually think that it can hit almost every theme. So the obvious ones are war and conflict and power and nature, but there is also loss in there, as in like loss of sanity and health, and same with identity, your identity sort of becomes your mental health. A bit difficult maybe, but it is still a link. So here's a really, really quick overview of the poem. So they're waiting in the trenches, right, knowing that something can happen at any moment. And that's why there's so much, but nothing happens. It's highlighting that kind of waiting and waiting and the endlessness of it. But as the snow comes down, things get really cold. And not only does it get really cold, but the soldiers are also neglected. So they're not given appropriate things to protect from the snow. So a lot of soldiers are kind of they're dying from weather conditions essentially, and it's not from actual battle, so it's very unnecessary. Some of them were affected by hypothermia, which we see here in things like Littered with Blossoms, where the blackbird fusses. This is because hypothermia can cause hallucinations, and this positive, pretty imagery is definitely a representation of this. There is hallucination of pretty things, like blossoms, and then afterwards their ghosts drag home, but they are still affected by the war because the doors have closed on them. So things like shell shock, as it was called back then, or PTSD still affect them. So obviously Owen was a soldier in World War One, and he himself was actually diagnosed with PTSD, but back then it wasn't really acknowledged as a proper mental health issue. Soldiers were just kind of thought of as crazy, and people didn't really understand what was going on or the trauma involved, which meant that these people were kind of just shut out from society as outsiders. This explains the quote, "On us all the doors are closed." A lot of this could have been prevented, of course. There was a neglect of army soldiers' mental health, but also physical health. So Owen actually wrote something called Dulce et Decorum Est, which kind of details how dying for war and your country is a bit overrated almost. It literally means it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. But for obvious reasons, Owen doesn't think this. He has first-hand experience with some of the most horrible stuff, but unfortunately and sadly, he did die in battle in 1918, and that is only 10 days before the war ended. So he died 10 days before the war ended, which is really obviously sad. But luckily, we do have his poetry to remember him by, and a little bit of his thought process surrounding it too. He was a big fan of Keats, and he was inspired by Keats, and often at the beginning of his life wrote pretty poetry. So Keats wrote a lot of pretty tragedies. If you go on to A level, you might end up studying it. But Keats wrote a lot about love and beauty, and then throughout his life, Owen gradually transitioned from writing pretty poetry to poetry that kind of represented ugliness, like the brutality of war, like we see here. But of course, we have to link context to language and structure. So I'm going to start with structure. A lot of these you might have heard of before, but I'm going to start with a consistent rhyme scheme. So I think it's consistent because it's monotonous. You've probably heard that. It reflects the refrain, but nothing happens. They're all power rhymes though, so they don't quite work together. It feels a bit uncomfortable. It's not quite nice to listen to. And these are done in the ABBA format, also known as enclosed rhyme. And this might reflect the inescapable nature of war. But of course, there is no doubt that this is reinforced by the cyclical structure. There is always this sense of, but nothing happens, but nothing happens, but nothing happens all the time, and that is a cyclical structure. So moving on to analysis, we've got our brains ache. It's obviously a really strong line in itself, but I want to focus on how it's paired with caesura here, really, because what this does is it essentially breaks this clause away from the rest of the sentence. It emphasises the word ache, which is a word of pain, and so we are immediately introduced to the tone of the poem. We also have merciless. So merciless is personification because, winds can't actually have mercy in the first place, and therefore they can't have no mercy, if that makes sense. But we also have iced and east. So those I and E sounds produce assonance, which is just the elongated vowel sounds essentially. And I think this elongation makes it clear that it really does feel like the war is going on forever. We have the same thing in knife as well, but the difference with knife is that it is a word of pain. It's a word of violence, and almost an intentional word of violence too, because you don't knife something unless you kind of mean to, you know? And then we have the ellipsis, the ... which heightens that sense of suspense, where all the time nothing is happening, but we are waiting for something. We're waiting for a narrative to start, but there is nothing. I think words like confuse and curious really add to this. There is the ultimate sense of uncertainty. There's also this list, so centuries whisper, curious, nervous, which heightens that. You don't even need me to tell you about that refrain, you know, we've been through it. So this next stanza has personification in the first line. We've got mad and we've got tugging. Mad suggests insanity, but it also suggests anger. So is the wind angry at those in power? Does it show just how powerful it is? And tugging also kind of suggests intentionality. We also have twitching agonies, which obviously is gruesome imagery and really puts forward the idea of pain and suffering, and it's incessant, which really does give this idea that it does not give up. It really is endless. And not only is there the sound of another war, but it's a dull rumour, like it's almost not real. You know how rumours are kind of just rumours. Doled out as well, so as a sound, this gives the idea of being muffled. It is just some other war, so not one that matters or one that they care about. It's just one that exists somewhere. The cold actually affects them more than anything else, so this is their real war, and this is where we start to hear a little bit about this. So dawn here is repeated a couple of times in this stanza, which is interesting because it's almost like Owen is wishing to emphasise it. Is it because dawn is known to be sometimes kind of cold, even in summer? Or is it because it's associated with new beginnings, which this most certainly is not? Is it placed here with irony? Maybe. Dawn is also being repeated, I think, to emphasise how time doesn't really feel like it's moving forward. It's personification too. We've got misery of dawn. Dawn can't be miserable, and interestingly, dawn is also seen positively usually, so it's definitely an interesting one. The poem is full of juxtapositions, so dawn grows because the day is advancing, and the day is negative because it means more war, but it is growing around the soldiers who are not growing at all. If anything, they are shrinking away from life, these soldiers. So this is shown in a couple stanzas time with cringing holes, shrinking away from life. Then we also have listings of weather. So listing creates, again, this effect of endlessness. It goes on, and it's also pathetic fallacy, which means the weather matches the mood. So war lasts, of course it does, and rain soaks. So soaks kind of gives this idea of inescapableness too. Memories and war experiences, like the rain, are fully soaking into him, and he'll never really be able to get rid of them. Not really. And then the clouds are sagging, and it does feel like even the clouds are tired of it all. It really does give this impression of being fed up and unhappy. And the sibilance too, the repeated S, kind of gives that sinister feel. It almost feels like there's something behind it all, trying to make it feel awful. So there is ambiguity in the next line, and I think the melancholy army is clouds, and an army of clouds sounds really strange. It's almost oxymoronic because, you know, we usually associate clouds with the kind of soft stuff, but we also have a melancholy army, and the clouds are sagging, so the weather does really seem as fed up as the soldiers. But we are seeing war imagery here too, so we've got the weather described as an army, of course, and it's also called deadly, so it's clear what Owen is trying to do here. He's trying to make the weather seem like it's the most deadly. And the ranks, again, is war imagery, and so is attacks. So these are words that are implying there is more to the weather than meets the eye. But they are shivering. Could it be that the clouds also represent the soldiers? You know, the soldiers are also associated with war imagery because obviously they're soldiers. The fact that they should be more worried about the clouds than the other soldiers really does say something. On the next stanza, we've got the word sudden. It's kind of just there at the beginning of the stanza. The appearance of the bullets is really sudden. There is no doubt that the sibilance here is intended to mimic the sounds of the bullets soaring past as they streak. And then on the next line, we can see the personification in that even the air is shuddering under the cold of the snow. And black with snow is a bit of an oxymoron, considering how snow is very white. Black is obviously associated with death and illness, which makes a lot of sense here. There is also a sense of not just the wind being nonchalant, but all of the weather. So wandering is very casual, as if the flakes don't really know the damage they're causing or don't really care. Wilfred Owen clearly really likes to use fricative alliteration. We can see that here in this stanza, which is just alliteration that repeats the F sound. So I think it kind of mimics the sound of snow hitting snow, and there's no doubt that cringe has connotations of pain, which you would obviously shrink away from. I know its contemporary meaning is a bit different though, but anyway, Forgotten Dreams is an interesting one because it does suggest that soldiers had dreams before they became soldiers, which now they cannot go through with. Why can't they go through with them? Well, it's because on them all the doors are closed, see, because essentially, even if they didn't die in battle, they might have long-term health issues or mental health issues too. I mean, think PTSD, and it's interesting that the word dreams is included in this stanza because it's exactly in this stanza where the dreams start to show themselves. So we've got littered with blossoms and sun dozed, and both of these are completely not happening. It's all hallucination. The hypothermia is making them hallucinate. We've got blossoms as positive imagery and absolutely beautiful, but even through where the imagery is beautiful, we still have more negative stuff, like littered, which has connotations of waste. We are alerted to the fact that this is still negative and that perhaps the soldier's mental health is going to waste too. And interestingly, we have about the blackbird. Blackbirds, depending on culture, can be seen as different symbols, of course, but when I ask my students about the symbol of the blackbird, most commonly they link it with death, and I think that says a lot in itself. So the blackbird acts as a symbol of the inevitable deaths to come. Interestingly, they're also talking about ghosts. It's like they're dead before they're actually dead, if you know what I mean. All the way through this clause, we have assonance as well. So slowly, ghosts, home, where the vowel sound of the O is elongated. It almost sounds like moans of pain. And dragging, there seems to be a kind of reluctance there, doesn't there? Not even that, but they just aren't happy. It has a slowness to it, and I'm not actually too sure why he's chosen to use the phrase crusted dark jewels. It's beautiful imagery, but it probably is something to do with how precious the fire is, and obviously dark red is like blood or even poppies, so it kind of represents as well how the war is sticking around. Glozed is also an archaic form of glaze, so their ghosts are glazed with dark red. Ambiguous, but very interesting. In On Us All the Doors Are Closed, I think this might be representing how the mental health issues became such an issue that there are no real pathways to take in life anymore. It affects them so much that they are kind of discriminated against. And this means that the shutters and doors are a metaphor. But I think that the use of the word us is really overlooked here in a lot of cases, because what it does is it highlights the fact that this is a collective experience and that so many soldiers were forced to go through it. And it almost has a kind of tone of them versus us. But the them is a bit ambiguous. Who is shutting the doors on them? Is it their families? Is it the government or the people in power? Maybe it's everyone. It's kind of impossible to know, but still interesting. So this is the last two stanzas. I think the most interesting line in this stanza here is personifying the sun. So the sun's smile, true on child. So the sun obviously represents light and happiness, and light is symbolic of truth. So I think ultimately here we are presented with the ultimate truth. Field and fruit also connotes fertile landscape, which contrasts the landscape in which all of the soldiers are dying, of course. It's almost paradise-like in comparison, all these fields and fruits, which is interesting in a stanza where God is referenced twice. Love of God seems dying because they're not in the paradise they are supposed to be in, and this possibly links back to how Owen used to work in a church but began to lose faith a bit when he finds it hypocritical. On the next stanza, fasten, of course, gives entrapping vibes. It also suggests that there is kind of something holding them down. This mud and us is an interesting one as well because it kind of equates the soldiers with mud, which is seen as a bit of a negative, almost worthless. So is this how the people in power actually see the soldiers? So this would be good to compare with something like London, because this mud and us kind of links to, you know, the soldiers' sigh runs in blood down palace walls. There is this idea that the soldiers are worth nothing and they're just disposable. And this burying party implies the deaths of the soldiers as something to be celebrated, which is, in some ways, what people did. So dying for your country was so heroic that it almost wasn't sad, so the burials were a party. But it also could be political if you think about it. So we have political parties, and the burying party are the party who send the soldiers out to die for their country. Again, a potential nod to the abuse of power. Half known is also interesting because they can only be half known since they are insignificant according to those who bury them, who are the powerful people. The last line, obviously, is "but nothing happens," which of course is an anticlimax. It's an anticlimax because the whole time we're expecting something to happen. We're expecting there to be some kind of narrative because, you know, what is a poem without a narrative? But that's exactly what this is. It's showing the monotony of waiting in the trenches, but it's also showing just how frightening it is. Sitting and waiting is actually worse than being out there and getting it over and done with and running with adrenaline. In my opinion anyway, a constant state of anxiety would be spreading through the trenches, and alternatively, this could just be a representation of how nothing happens, nothing gets better, and nobody in power cares about them enough or will ever care about them. But, you know, it really depends on the argument you're trying to make. I'm going to leave you with a little quote from a guy called Yeats, who was also a poet. And he actually really disliked Owen, but I think it would be a good quote to think about. So this is actually a bit more of an A-level style question, but have a think anyway. So he says that passive suffering is not a theme for poetry in reference to Owen. Do you agree with this? Why or why not? Do you think that Wilfred Owen's exposure is just a representation of passive suffering, or is it something more? Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and if you have any other ideas or interesting information bites, then definitely put them in the comments. Remember that there is no right answer in literature and every interpretation is awesome.